This is an interview for the oral history program at the Institute for Latino Studies at the University of Notre Dame, specifically for Letras Latinas, the literary program of the Institute. Today is March 30th, 2007. We are at the ILS Annex on Notre Dame Avenue. My name is Francisco Aragon, and I'm interviewing Richard Blanco. Thank you, Richard, for participating in our oral history program. Would you please state your full name, date, and place of birth?
Ricardo de Jesus Blanco Valdez. Valdez Blanco, that's pretty good. Date of birth, 2/15/68.
Okay. Where were you born?
I was born in Madrid, Spain.
Oh, cool. Okay. Well, actually, that's a good segue to the first area that I'd like to discuss with you, and that is where you grew up, things about where you grew up, your childhood, and other members of your family, just to familiarize yourself.
Yeah. Well, as I always jokingly like to say, that it was made in Cuba, assembled in Spain, and imported to the United States. My mother left Cuba 7 months pregnant with me. And then I was born in Spain, and I think we were there a total of 2 months. And from then we migrated when I was only 45 days old to Manhattan. In fact, it was just on January 28th. My mother still remembers the day they left from Spain. And then eventually really grew up in Miami since about 5 years old, where I was raised and educated.
So Miami is home for you.
Miami is home, although the weird irony of that whole sort of journey is that I was a citizen of no country till I was like 17 years old, because Spain doesn't really recognize your citizenship automatically. You don't leave the country with like citizenship papers or anything like that. So you have to apply for citizenship and go through a process. So since we were kind of working class, we didn't travel till I was like 17. We went to Mexico, I think, and suddenly Richard was not, or Ricardito was not a citizen of any country, which is interesting.
Really?
Besides that, growing up in Miami, which is a very different Miami than the Miami that people see today, or that we see in the media, really. It was Miami in the 1970s was a much quieter place. It was much more homogenous in terms, and by that I mean Cuban.
Yeah.
Mostly either Cuban or the Anglo contingency that had lived there since the 60s, probably. And so I always tell people, because sometimes I have a disconnect sometimes with other Latino authors or other Latino communities, in that, in my neighborhood, being Cuban was the thing. And the kids that used to get picked on in my class, or the one kid, Brian Kunkel, was because he had freckles and was, he didn't know Spanish. And so it's this weird reverse prejudice that,
Yeah.
and it's always been a sort of a constant focus for me, or a constant reference point for me, because I always realized that, in some ways we all have the capacity to be the other in a way.
Yeah.
So that was very interesting, but it was also a bubble. I mean, I never realized I was really very different, other than sort of seeing TV programs. And so there was an America that was out there, that was I Love Lucy, that was the Brady Bunch. That was what I thought America was, literally. That was somewhere up north, somewhere, north of Broward County at least, of Dade County at least. And so you grew up very safe in a way, and it was a very sort of nurturing environment, culture environment. Nonetheless, there's always, of course, that aura of the exile, like, well, we're just here for a little while.
And was
Cuba, et cetera, et
was
cetera.
that aura of the exile because your parents had dreams of going back to Cuba at some point?
Well, everybody, the whole community did, and so even if they weren't sort of explicitly expressed dreams about this or that, the other, there's just sort of this sense of there's this other place that we belong to, and we're going back. And this wonderful place, this place that was paradise, and that we left because we had to.
So were your parents born in Cuba?
My parents were both born in Cuba.
Okay.
And my grandparents as well. My great-grandparents immigrated, were the first immigrants to Cuba in that generation.
From where?
All sort of from Canary Islands.
Interesting.
Isleños, as they call them in Cuba.
Yeah.
From Asturias.
Okay.
There's one other part in Spain.
Galicia? No.
And Galicia, yes.
In Galicia.
Gallegos. In fact, my family still calls me a galleguito because in in s- in Cuba, anybody from Spain was automatically a gallego because there were so many
Yeah.
from Galicia, so it was like the predominant sort of.
So then, that's interesting. So, given the fact that your origins go back to Spain, has that ever influenced the way you view yourself as opposed to a Cuban whose origins maybe might go back to other parts of the world?
I've traveled to Spain, and I must say that I feel very at home in Spain. And in fact, this summer I want to see if I go to the Canary Islands
Uh-huh.
to sort of snoop around a little bit too. Um, I felt comfortable there, but it is also very distant in the sense of we're talking like 3 generations ago. If anything, I would like to do that as a project. Someday is like to just go back and see. As one gets older, you start really, sort of like I research my immediate roots, sort of my Cubanness, my grandparents, and it just kind of keeps on going. You want to find out more and more and more. So I'm finding out. The thing is, those generations, there's very few left already. As I've been sort of slowly asking questions to some of my grandmother's sisters and stuff, and finding out all these funny.
So when you say you feel at home in Spain, what parts of Spain have you been to?
I've been to Madrid and Barcelona and Sitges, which is south of Barcelona.
Mm-hmm.
But it's just
So,
kind of.
so you haven't been north yet, then? You haven't been
Not
to
north.
you haven't been to Asturias or Galicia?
No.
Okay.
I've been to. I have cousins that stayed in Bilbao.
The Basque Country.
But one thing I remember is like crossing the train from Paris to Barcelona on one trip, and of course Paris is Paris, but the train that we were going on was a Spanish company, and as soon as we got on, there were people screaming, the kids running around, everybody in the bar till like 3 a.m. smoking cigarettes, and like I was like, oh, this I know. So it was just this weird sense of life sort of carried over that was, which caught me by surprise because I really wasn't expecting. I wasn't looking for that.
Yeah, yeah.
I know this. This is a family reunion in my house.
Yeah. Brothers, sisters? Do you have any siblings?
I have an older brother whose name is Carlos, just like my father's name, just like my grandfather's name, just like my great-grandfather's name.
Mm-hmm.
And he's kind of doesn't share the same interests or sort of feeling about being Cuban. And my mother and I always kind of find it ironic because he grew up in Cuba until he was 6 years old. But he really just has no. I don't think he even knows how to dance salsa. His kids don't speak Spanish really.
Mm-hmm.
He doesn't really have. It's not that he hates his background. He just sort of never has a curiosity or an issue or an identity issue or nothing like that. And I think the difference is, and I try to make this also, between so many different generations of what it means to be Cuban American. Like just 6 years makes a really big difference in your perspective. And I always thought, well, why should I care? Or why should I feel these yearnings, these cultural yearnings for? And I think it's precisely because I never saw anything real, so it was always in the imagination.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's like you're always trying to reach that which people have talked about, that other people have experienced, but you never got to know. So it was like this myth, something that existed that you wanted to grab. And I think that searching came out in the writing. It was like this quest to find out what is this mythic homeland, this place that everybody's talking about, and I've never been there, and we're going back.
So you haven't actually? Have you been to Cuba before?
I've been to Cuba 4 times.
4 times.
And I was just reminded that I need to go again soon.
How old were you the first time you went?
I think it was 94. I'm not sure how old that would have made me, but I think it was like mid-20s.
It's interesting because this is an interesting question that I've discussed with Orlando Menace, and he sort of had the same take in that he was interested in Cuba because he'd never been there. He only went for the first time like 4 years ago as an adult. And you mentioned that maybe 6 years made a difference between you and your brother, which is an interesting contrast because when I was talking to Naomi this morning, she spent her first 15 years in Puerto Rico, and she very much feels, identifies with the island. What about growing up in your household? What role did books have in your household? This is always an interesting question about which of course leads into the whole area of how you got into writing. Was yours a household with lots of books, or?
No. I mean, again, we were like my mother has a my mother's a a PED, I mean, what would be the equivalent from Cuba. And she was the youngest of 8 brothers and sisters, and the only one that got an education because she fought for it. My father was a military man in Cuba, a naval man, I should say.
Mhm.
And so basically I come from very sort of working class, you know, salt of the earth kind of Cuban.
Mhm.
And so, no, we did not discuss literature. Picasso was not a topic of conversation. I grew up in a culturally arts void in my house. In fact, you know, there were like, as I was older and like started sort of doing this or a painting or a poem or something like that, it was sort of met with like, I gotta say, with like, you know, some kind of
Derision?
well, like sexuality issues, like, you know, that stuff is too gay. Like,
Yeah.
you know, the Latino machismo kind of like,
Yeah.
what are you doing painting? You know? Shouldn't you be out cutting the grass or playing some in the backyard or something? So that's one aspect of it, and just the fact that, you know, it was just a working class. I mean, it was especially having moved here. You know, the business was survival. It was about working. It was about getting a good career. You know, they did believe a lot in education, and so, you know,
What about your English classes in high school? Did you have any?
in high school, well, in grade school, obviously we don't read too much poetry or anything like that. And English was always my worst subject through high school included. Ironies, right?
Yeah.
But I do remember one particular teacher, Mr. Panzer, which we had a great time with his name, who taught me a love for language and words and vocabulary, only because the way he used to teach vocabulary was just like, I still remember certain words because of the jokes he would make, and he imprinted in us, I think, a love for language. And I remember reading the love song of J. Alfred Prufrock and going like, I get it. Like, and like, it was this sense of just a knowing.
You were reading.
Present.
You were reading Prufrock in high school.
Yeah.
So this was
senior year.
So this was in class reading, not something you read on your own.
Yeah.
Huh.
And so I kind of, you know, kind of tabled all that. There was always sort of these creative bones or these creative curiosities that I had, but it was never supported in the sense because my parents sort of didn't know what to do with that. I was like, are you going to study what? Like, so.
And is that what led to you majoring in studying engineering as an
Yeah,
undergraduate?
precisely. Yeah, there was, you know, for lack of guidance or orientation, and again, it also has to do with growing up in Miami, so that there's like this cultural bubble. I didn't know Notre Dame existed. I didn't know what were Ivy League schools. We grew up in this sort of cultural bubble. We knew people just like us, and that was pretty much it. So not knowing options and stuff, and I just kind of followed my parents' advice, and, you know, it was either doctor, lawyer, or engineer, and I picked the lesser of 3 evils. And even my father didn't want me to be a civil engineer because he said they sweat too much. They have to be out in the field inspecting things. And I'm like, okay. So the original plan was to study in civil engineering, specialize in structural engineering, and get a master's in architecture. But I did that. I just kind of listened to them. I had a problem with that for years afterwards, but now I'm in a very wonderful space. I went back to engineering. We can talk about that later, maybe.
Yeah.
But I find it's given me yet another interesting perspective on being
Of
a
course,
writer
of course.
and also
But while you were doing your major as an engineer, did you take undergraduate courses in English and poetry, or did you discover it further in that time?
two things happened. One was sophomore college English. I had a teacher who it was more like scholarly writing. And I wrote this like personal essay about it. I don't even remember. It was probably horrible. She gave me a C, and I was like, "How dare you?" And but she taught me what it meant to look at literature, which was sort of a nice. You know, it wasn't a great aha moment, but it was a step in the right direction. That was the last time I ever wrote a paper or did anything with language until 3 years later. And I had postponed taking this class at Florida International University that's called you have to take another Gordon Rule writing requirement that I postponed to the very last semester when I was graduating, and it was history of the Peloponnesian Wars. And I had this amazing professor who's still my mentor today, Dr. Pyron. And I was freaking out. I'm like, I don't know how to write this. Like, I haven't been written in 3 years. I've just been doing calculus.
Yeah.
And he just sat down with me and said, look at it as an engineering problem. You have to solve this. You have to support this theorem. Now, how would you do that? And to my surprise, he graded anonymously, and the first paper I got an A+.
Wow.
So that was a great sign. And ever since then, it left me like a little sort of hope about doing some, kind of left an imprint on my, not that I said I wanted to be a writer from now, but I was like,
Yeah.
oh, I'm just.
So, if I'm hearing you correctly, are you saying then that during your years as an undergraduate, you weren't writing poems?
Oh, no.
Okay.
I didn't start writing until about a year after. So I graduated when I was like 23. I started working in a firm, in the same firm that I had been working part-time already. So it wasn't really a great transition point, but got my degree. Still kind of a little resentful of like, man, it was engineering. At 23, you think you're the bomb, and sort of engineering didn't fit my personality. I was like, I'm destined to be much greater things than these boring engineers. And just fooling around, just sort of, I knew I wanted to do something creative. I had painted some things, and I entered something in some art show. It was horrible, and I recognized it was horrible when I saw everybody else's painting. And I just sort of stood, because I think writing is so accessible in a way that, all you need is paper and pen. You don't need to take, at least in an initial, where there are materials that are familiar to us, pencil and paper, we've been doing that since kindergarten.
Yeah.
And I just started penning some things down, and I kept on sharing. I was never a shy writer. I was like, here, why don't you read this?
Yeah.
And a couple people along the way sort of like, well, that's nice, blah, blah. But there was one girl in particular, Christina Rivera, who at the time was finishing a degree in English at Florida International University. And she read the work, and she was like, you have some talent. You should continue. You should think about pursuing this. And why don't you get an MFA? And I was like, what's an MFA? And she sort of mentored me in that way, learning that there were possibilities and avenues and doors, and that I could do something with this. And so I did. I started writing. I was very enthusiastic. I wrote, my first 10 official poems and mailed them to FIU to get into the graduate program. And it was, of course, rejected. But they did send a letter saying that they saw some potential and that they wanted me to take classes. And so I thought, well, so I called the director, and I told her, the director of the undergraduate, of the graduate admissions for the department, and I said, is this just some bullshit letter? You just want me to take classes to so I can pay for courses and stuff, or do you really mean what you say? And she'd laugh. We laugh about it now because, of course, being so naive. She said, no, we don't write that letter to just anybody. We do see something, but you're very young in your writing, and, we're just not sure, how much of a chance we can take with you. And so I worked really hard. I took a graduate course with Campbell McGrath. His first class at FIU was my first class at FIU in the graduate, and I walked in from engineering school into a graduate
literature
writing workshop.
Okay.
And I thought, holy crap.
Now, so at that point, how would you have described what you had under your belt as a reader? Because I'm thinking as a reader, who had you read?
No, really, even until that point, I remember always stealing, or not really stealing, but just snooping through my brother's high school poetry books when I was younger. So I had Wordsworth. I had lines above Tintern Abbey. It's still one of my favorite poems because I was reading that. I was reading this girl had given me the Norton Anthology of Literature, so I was reading Williams. I was reading the people in there.
So at that point, you had not yet discovered contemporary American
a little bit
poetry.
Actually, not all that much, no. Other than people that sort of other poets and stuff that I met, sort of like going to open mic kind of things or whatever. But no, it wasn't really till graduate school and in that class with Campbell that I was like, oh, okay. And in particular, having read House on Mango Street, which I consider poetry,
Mm-hmm.
that really opened my eyes and said like, oh, I don't have to write about Tintern Abbey. That really, really opened my eyes to this sense of being a contemporary writer, writing about one's life and one's experiences in the now,
Yeah.
and not some abstracted version of it. I still came to the table with some sense of like, you know, like most
It's
amateur writers, you come with this sense of like,
it,
poetry is about just about the flowers and the this
yeah.
and that. And
It's interesting. I think that Sandra's book, House on Mango Street, has played that role for lots of writers as far as giving you permission to write about what you know.
right.
Um, once you entered that world of being a poetry student with Campbell, aside from Sandra, do you remember some of the other authors whose work you read who sort of opened your eyes as far as different models to take on and when exploring how you were going to develop your own voice?
Right. I always answer these kind of questions with this. I don't necessarily have one author but I have poems, like individual poems that I think I keep on going back to and they keep on teaching me something, or, you know, just, I don't take one poem and think that everything this person writes is now for me, but for some reason in that poem there's being like, you know, like the Mark Halliday poem, for example, that I'm not like, I don't follow Mark Halliday, but there are certain pieces, and in graduate school you're exposed to a lot, you know, random pieces, and I think that's part of the function. However, there is, for me, continues to be Elizabeth Bishop, of all people, which I always find ironic. There's this like New England, you know, woman hair, you know, and this Cuban in my head, but I've always seen in her being in an emotional exile, and to me she captures that sense of exile in a way that I can see. It's a mirror, and it's not, but it's not a mirror. It's like, here's someone from a totally different background and experience going emotionally at the same, sort of dealing with the same questions of place, identity, and
Are there
home.
any particular poems come to mind of hers that you?
Questions of travel. You know, should we have stayed at home and thought of here? One Art, of course, which I think is the most perfect poem ever written so far.
How did you discover Elizabeth Bishop?
Huh?
How did you discover Elizabeth Bishop?
Through school.
Through school.
Yeah. And the weird is, like, at first, you know, it's the kind of, you revisit some of the authors as you keep on writing. So there was that. There's always, of course, Sandra was, you know, influential in that. I think, and I'm butchering the name probably because it's just, those consonant blends just are not in a Latino's lexicon. But, teaches at the university, he's Adam Zajewski.
Oh, Adam Zagajewski, the Polish writer, the Polish writer, who was
Yes.
at Houston.
And again, I think it's that same sense of displacement of
Yeah.
exile that I just read it, this is work, and I'm like, wow. I mean, you know, just in that wow of poetry that you can read a good poem and be like, wow, that's a good poem. You can read a poem that's just kind of like grabs you, you know. And it's so. Him, I followed somewhat, but I always look for individual poems and poets, because I'm not convinced that you know, that sort of not putting blinders on and saying, you know, I'm influenced by just these people or this one person, but rather I think it's all a big chorus, and I want to hear all the voices.
Well, that's interesting because I guess the other side of that coin, and maybe you're revealing to me that there's variety in this, what I'm about to say, but the other side of that coin might be that you discover a particular poem by a particular person and you're bowled away by it, like an Elizabeth Bishop poem, and you instinctively just want to read everything that person has written because you want to see if there's other jewels like the one that you've just discovered. But it sounds like what you're saying, if I hear you correctly, is that wasn't necessarily an impulse in you as a reader, that if you read some really interesting poems by one person, that you didn't automatically then go and devour everything that person published.
Right.
Huh.
I kind of kept on shopping around, you could say.
So even in the case, well, Elizabeth Bishop may not be the best example because her collected work is not really that large.
Right, like that I've read.
Yeah. Whereas if you came across a
Well,
Pablo
that's the
Neruda
other-
poem,
I mean, we're also living in a time right now where, you know, I'll go read with someone and they're like, so and so has written 9 books of poetry. I'm like, oh okay. I mean, I know I have a day job, and you find that all the time that there's these very worthwhile records, but there's so much, and that sometimes I feel overwhelmed, and so I just sort of stick. I'd rather read one good poem by 10 different authors and having just known one person, and
Mm-hmm.
I mean it might be a mistake on my part. I don't know. I think it gets to the same point.
Well,
As
you
look at
mentioned.
literature and
I,
have
th-
it
I, th-
inspire
I,
you.
th- I think that might be. That probably seem. I would imagine that's the case with a lot of people, as far as reading their peers and their contemporaries. But you mentioned Prufrock. So have you gone back and read all of Eliot? And if
Not
and
all of it. I've read some of it, but nothing is like Prufrock. I think in some ways I don't want to be disillusioned. Like
uh-huh.
there's like that has happened where I sometimes go back and buy the book from where this poem came from.
Yeah.
And I don't end up, and I guess that's fine. I mean, we can't always write you can't write Prufrock every day of your life, otherwise, you wouldn't be human. Um, so, that's kind of sometimes like, then it kind of like spoils the beautiful poem for me. So I just have sort of, also I think teaching has done that, because then in teaching, undergraduate especially, I try to give, assign a book of poetry, like, some of these kids have never read, poetry to begin with, say, at least where I was teaching. And so I try to expose them to a lot of different voices. You have Polish kids, you have Latino kids, you have like Anglo kids, and so I end up doing like my own little mini anthology of sort of my favorite poems project for the class.
Mm-hmm.
And that sort of continued that habit too, of just sort of looking for the poem here or there and just being happy with that.
While you were a graduate student in the MFA program, did you take any memorable literature seminars that gave you occasion to read extensively any particular author?
Certainly. We read, there was one class in particular that was taught by Campbell. It was called the First Book Class, that was, I think, like, just absolutely instrumental in getting my work published and seeing what a book of poetry really is.
Who were some of the
To my
people?
surprise, not all MFA programs have this course. And I'm like, okay.
That sounds fascinating. What
We
was
looked
it?
at first books of various authors and saw, what were their strategies, why they organized it this way, why didn't they, how could it have been a stronger book, where were some poems that we could have taken out, what are the strategies for putting together a book of poetry, and not just from the practical end of getting it published, but also from the practical end of getting it published, when you have a screener that has 100 manuscripts, and you better make sure your first poem is your top poem, because you gotta get the
Keep his
reader to
attention.
invest in you, so pass your manuscript. But no, so it's everything from that, but also just looking at the idea of a collection versus a book and how you.
Do you remember some of the authors you looked at in that course?
Kathy Bowman. I think we read Elizabeth Plath. Listen to me.
Sylvia Plath?
Sylvia Plath, which, by the way, is another person that also sort of reaches me. Sylvia Plath. I mean, some of the classic first books. I'm going back 10 years now, Francisco. Okay, those two come to mind. There was also, for my thesis, I had to do I had to have a reading list of some books. I picked Loose Woman, the Jimmy Santiago Baca book.
Black Mesa Poems or Martine and Meditations in the South Valley?
Right.
Meditations in the South Valley.
Amazing, sort of to read that whole thing.
Yeah.
That's a long.
Yeah,
so that
yeah.
was awesome.
2 long poems.
It was like reading 2 long poems.
Yeah.
Versus the book. Some of Martine's work, which I think has influenced me in a way that's gutsy. I mean, I don't think me and Martine has similar writing styles and things like that, but to be gutsy and like edgy. So Martine's I read. So part of that graduate program was, and I had to relate my work to them and be able to discuss it.
So you've mentioned, that's interesting that you mentioned Jimmy Santiago Baca and Martín Espada and Sandra Cisneros as being on that reading list. I think you said you discovered House on Mango Street on your own. Do you remember how you came across Baca's work and Espada's work?
Espada was recommended to me by Campbell, actually.
Okay.
And I think Baca too. I mean, again, we're talking about some little wet behind the ears kid here, like from engineering school. I had no idea what was out there. And so, even though, and the classes actually were predominantly, if you want to to say Anglo. I'm
Yeah.
not sure that's the right word.
Well,
But they were white authors predominantly because, well, that's what Campbell was,
yeah.
and that's what he knew mostly. But he also was very instrumental. In, hey, I found this. I read with this guy, or I've heard this guy read in New York one time. Why don't you look him up? And so he helped me out along the way too.
That's interesting. Which brings to mind a delicate question, and that is, so he recommended these two writers to you. I guess the question I would have, just to satisfy my own curiosity, because I don't know Campbell McGrath, was, maybe you can answer this, did he recommend Jimmy Santiago and Martin Espada because they were Latino and you're Latino, or was there something in their work that he saw that might resonate with you because of the work that he knew that you were writing? I have no idea what the answer to that is, but it's sort of, I know as a teacher myself, it's sometimes a double-edged sword because you discover someone who has talent.
Right,
that
right.
person happens to be of a certain ethnic background, and therefore you have to resist recommending books to that person only because, oh, you're Latino, so I have to recommend this Latino poet
Right,
to you, as opposed
right.
to, you're writing this way, here's a writer who might be useful for you to look at because of the way you're writing. That writer may or may not be African American.
I mean,
Latino.
Campbell probably, he had a little more forethought than just, I mean, he's a graduate, it's a graduate program, so I think he likes just strong work in whatever context, and so I think he was also seeing that in that light too, like, aside from your sharing your interests. But you make me think about, the sense of how, as for example, I've not mentioned any Cuban authors, and I sort of a discussion or a conversation I have with a lot of people and things in the same way that sort of I like Elizabeth Bishop. And about 2 years ago, I did a small panel in this Arkansas Literary Festival that was called Coming Out of the Anglo Closet. And I just took Naina Marie, H.G. Carrillo, and Manuel, and asked them to discuss the Anglo influences, which we never sort of get to talk about, or we never, or I should say that
people assume you don't have them.
The community always expects us to think that we're always looking inward for inspiration. But I find that sometimes it's also interesting because, and I use the I Love Lucy as a metaphor. It's like, I thought Ricky was a cornball. Like, there's nobody in my family that believes, but sure, I wanted to be Lucy. Like, she was the main character, but besides that, she was the one that was different. But somehow, her life was the chaos of my life too. So it was like, here, when you recognize the other going emotionally through something, it's very powerful because it's like, it's something different in the same way that, my audience is not Cubans. I mean, aside from the language barrier of the older generation, but I mean, the Cubans know Cubans, so like, they're not as moved or entertained or enlightened by my work as, say, someone who is more on the periphery of knowing Cuban culture or is interested.
Is audience something you think about when you're writing?
More so now, not when I started writing. I was sort of like started writing like House on Mango Street, Now I worry about it a little bit more, and I try not to, but I think it's natural. It's like sort of your career jitters, kind of like, well, is that book gonna sell, kind of thing.
So, do you think then, that's an interesting comment you make, because you also hear the anecdotes, for example, like a book on House on Mango Street, where you hear anecdotes of young aspiring Latino authors or Latino people in general who read that book and say, "Oh, look, this is a book that's depicting a life that I see myself in or that I recognize.
Right.
I've never seen anything like it before." And so, on the one hand, one might say that certain segments of the Latino population would gravitate towards a book like that because they can identify with the characters and the predicaments of the characters.
But still, House of Mango Street is the other for me. You know what I mean? It was somebody else. It was another culture which I had no exposure to. So even that sort of fits. And that's interesting because, in a sense, within the Latino, there is this cross-inspirational stuff because, well, New Yorkers' experience is completely different as it is to, you know, my neighbor Bob. You know, like it's they're both in this. I mean, other than okay, we have some linguistic, you know, commonalities, and so certainly there's some cultural, but still, like growing up in New York, Puerto Rican is not growing up in Miami, Cuban.
Mm-hmm.
You know,
Mm-hmm.
we might still
Or
drink
growing up
coffee
Chicano in
or growing up
Chicago.
Chicago, and so there's still the element of the other, which is fascinating.
So,
But it's less intimidating, and I think it also makes for great inspiration.
well,
Like you
would
said,
you be
like House on
surprised?
Mango Street.
Would you be surprised if you knew of a young, aspiring Cuban American poet who viewed your work as a touchstone because they haven't seen anyone writing about that in such a way? I mean, I know of one person. Maybe I'm just sad that he couldn't come to the Jorge Sanchez, the young Cuban poet who has an MFA from Michigan. Jorge was probably, I suspect, in his late 20s, early 30s. But you know, he
Right.
shared with me discovering your work and having that moment of, oh yeah, that's how it can be done.
Right.
And so now he sort of, in some ways, is writing out of that Cuban American experience, talking primarily about.
That doesn't surprise me, but where did he grow up?
That's a good question. I don't
Because
know.
I think that also has a lot to do with it when you're constantly exposed to your culture. Like sometimes people get lost, and then there's like they suddenly see something directly related to the culture and say like, "Wow, it's like a homecoming." Like, you know, I can see this. This has been missing in my, you know, in my world, in my readings, and so I can certainly see that. You know.
So you're saying then that possibly you can see that happening with maybe a Cuban American who grew up in New Jersey,
Right.
and
Or,
who has
yeah.
encountered your work, and has not grown up in a Miami, but has grown up in an area where there's
more isolated,
Yeah.
and also generationally. So there's a generational issue, so that you know the generation after me or the half generation after me hasn't had even in Miami, like you know, the Cuban culture is changing a lot. It's no longer the dominant culture. It's still predominant, but not the dominant culture. So there are like even my nephews who would like maybe someday grow up and go to Notre Dame and like
yeah.
and then you know be completely detached from their culture, and then one day like at 21 go and read something and go, wow, you know, I can reconnect. It's more like I think it was sort of maybe a reconnection.
I'm going to ask you to read a poem, one of my favorite poems of your second book, which I think is going to serve as a springboard to the final questions I'm going to ask you. And it's the poem called Somewhere to Paris.
Okay. Let's see. The vias of Italy turn to memory with each turn and clack of the train's wheels. With every stitch of track we leave behind, the Duomos return again to my imagination, already imagining Paris, a fantasy of lights and marble that may end when the train stops at Gare d'Est and I step into the daylight. In the space between cities, between the dreamed and the dreaming, there is no map, no legend, no ancient street names or arrows to follow, no red dot assuring me you are here and no place else. If I don't know where I am, then I am only these heartbeats, my breaths, the mountains rising and falling like a wave scrolling across the train's window. I am alone with the moon on its path, staring like a blank page, sheer and white as the snow on the peaks echoing back its light. I am this solitude, never more beautiful. The arc of space I travel through for a few hours, touching nothing and keeping nothing, with nothing to deny the night, the dark pines pointing to the stars. This life, always moving and still.
One of the things I enjoyed about that poem and poems like Crossing Boston Harbor, one of your themes seems to be, and this is just my reading of it, sort of this homelessness, being in between places and actually trying to make art out of those liminal spaces where you're not here or there. And you have a poem that has Paris in the title, and immediately certain expectations in the reader come up, but you seem to thwart those. Can you talk a little bit about if I'm on the right track, and also what role travel has had in your work.
Well, that's something that actually sort of has come full circle in my own understanding. Is the beautiful thing about artists, or you're writing ahead of yourself, ahead of your life. But I've put it in perspective, and looking back, it seems again, I grew up with between two myths always. One was the Cuba of 1950, pre-revolutionary Cuba, great place, beaches, etc. My family. It was a myth. The other myth was America. Again, growing up in Miami, America was this place up north. It was the TVs. It was the commercials. It was people that spoke English all the time. And so I grew up with a complete sense of, or no sense of home whatsoever. Because I wasn't attached to this country. I wasn't attached to, you can't be attached to myths. And I'm realizing now in my writing, I think the first book was more about getting the narrative down of that story. That was the house on Mango Street. It was about telling the anecdotes. It was about the funny stuff. It was about the journey. And now, I'm looking at my work as like, well, how is that experience? How does that cultural background serve as sort of a metaphor for understanding life?
Mm-hmm.
Our existence. And what I'm finding is that, I'm still caught in between myths, and I'm still sort of looking for my echo. The best way I can describe it is like sometimes I just feel like, I have this brother that was taken away from me at birth, or a twin if you want to be really metaphorical.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And I'm spending the rest of my life looking for him.
Mm-hmm.
And just like when I'm about to catch him, he disappears. And so it's like always in that nether space, in that space between places that I think is what I've known.
Mm-hmm.
And this was my childhood, to be neither here nor there.
And has travel enriched that journey? You seem to have.
Because at first the travel was like always trying to find that perfect place, trying to find that brother and where he lived, and
Mm-hmm.
And now I've realized that perfect place doesn't really exist. But what I love about travel is that it allows you now, with this perspective, to be, in a sense, a completely attached and detached traveler. So you realize that everything is relative, and you become sort of a citizen of the world. I think in that sense, where you're no longer just going someplace just to know it, or just because it's like this or like that, or you want to live there, or you think
Mm-hmm.
it's paradise or whatnot, but just exploring how other people have created their own myths in the places that they
Yeah.
live, and how it's all a myth, and like that sense of place, I love that. Oh, I just love such and such a place. I was like, have you lived there? No, we went for 2 weeks. Oh, like it's
Well,
another myth that we
well,
create.
well,
Our travel is a myth. It's a constant
One,
myth building.
one of the things I admire about the second book, as someone who lived in Spain for 10 years, and is that your poems, the poems of yours that take place in spaces outside of the U.S., don't at all seem to me like tourist poems.
Right.
That's always the danger of going someplace
Writing about something.
and then writing about it, and then it might even be well written, but
It has no emotional authority.
it has,
It's
yeah.
almost kind of
And so I'm wondering if that was a concern of yours when you sat down to address some of these the poems you wrote in Guatemala, the poems you wrote in Europe. Was that a concern? And if so, did you have any models in mind when you were thinking, okay, I want to avoid? Okay.
But also the sense of like, I think just also from a creative perspective, like, everybody knows, Rome, I wasn't going to state the obvious, so I tried to look for the particular moment where I really connected with the city that was usually, and I'm a horrible tourist, I can't stand going on all those, and this building was like, da-da-da, I was like, I don't care, I want to sit in the cafe and have, like coffee and just watch people, or like, meet someone local and like go to a bar or something.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm always looking for those particular moments where I'm really connecting with their myth, whatever myth this city has created for itself, and try to, identify with that, and that's where the poem comes for me.
So Elizabeth Bishop was one model on how to do it, as far as talking about a culture.
Right, in particular, the questions of travel, which she questions the very idea of
Yeah.
being a voyeur, of like, why are we here even? Like this
Mm-hmm.
sense of,
Mm-hmm.
why do we travel if we can, should we have stayed at home and thought of here? Isn't it the same just to think about a
Yeah.
place than to actually be there? And she was questioning all those kinds of ways in which we handle. And travel is fascinating in that sense because it is one way in which we engage with place and automatically are forced to questions about home and identity and comparisons and contrasts and what's
Mm-hmm.
this and what's that and why do you like this and why do you not like that and like I'm this and I'm like that, so and it challenges what you think you are and how you see yourself
Mm-hmm.
in your own myth, in your own city, in your own spaces.
You mentioned that this quest is something that maybe that's what you sort of view your life's work as. Like your first book was your House on Mango Street book. Your second book, you seem to be, at least in my view, sort of like a transitional book because you talk about the Cuba still, but you
Right,
also
right.
talk about non-Cuban subjects. But yet this journey is prevalent in that second book. And you talk, in thinking about your future work, do you see yourself continuing to write in a similar vein? And I guess by saying that, and you can correct me if I'm oversimplifying, but I do sort of see the first two books, as far as the way they're executed, coming out of that narrative tradition that we have in American poetry, narrative lyric poetry. I'm wondering if you foresee, as you begin to do your work that'll maybe come into a third and fourth book, if you foresee yourself going in different directions as far as how you execute the poem. And here I'm thinking about, in American poetry, we have the spectrum from the very, very experimental to the very, very less experimental, more narrative. Is this even a debate that concerns
Yes,
you?
and no, it's very timely that you asked me that actually because I finished that second book and it's time to push out another one. Um, I see the narrative in there. I still have narrative left in me, but I think what I'm doing with that is I want to write a nonfiction or fiction piece. There's still like all these great family anecdotes and things and memories of growing up between those two myths that I still want to get down. I don't want to let them go. But and I think that's sort of a beginning of another genre for me. So it's understandable that it starts again in that space of narrative.
So you're thinking of saving that material for prose?
Right, for prose. And then what I'm working on now is again, believe it or not, I've been only marginally looking at Latin American poetry for this big anthology I have. And I'm starting to think in Spanish.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm starting to think the way that Spanish writers, not Spanish from Spain, but Latin American and Spanish language writers, have this great sort of capacity for metaphor in the work. And so I'm doing stuff that's completely, but I'm like, Richard, what are you doing? Like as you know, my work is very imagistic, very detailed, like sometimes to my detriment. Very very like you can walk into the room and you're in the poem and you can see everything in the room and I'm sort of being now just more metaphorical and big, just the isolating the one detail that's important, being very spare, working. I just wrote this poem called a pantoum that just came out like in 3 hours. And it's just about walking through a city, an unknown city, watching the rain and looking for my echo, that kind of
Mm-hmm.
metaphor. And I just love the way that Latin Americans, from what little I've read, kind of handle that. And so it's the same sense of the traveler, the loneliness, the looking for, the in-between spaces, the looking for my echo, but handled in a completely different way because I just feel like in poetry it's taking me there. And so yes, I'm executing the poems differently, being much shorter.
So more minimalist?
Yeah, not feeling like I have to put every single detail, not feeling like I have to load the poem with metaphors and You know, just the carefully chosen words that carry more of the feeling and the metaphor.
Are you thinking of even as I'm hearing you talk about this, I'm thinking, are you talking about shorter lines?
Shorter lines, much shorter lines, much shorter poems in general. And it's surprising, it's caught me by surprise. It's very exciting for me. I mean, it might be my best work ever, or my worst, I don't know, but it's very exciting, you know.
One thing, before I forget, because you mentioned prose as a possible vehicle for some of the stuff that you still have brewing inside you. Your book, your Directions to the Beach of the Dead, has poems that are in verse, and you have these interesting, very rich prose poems. And I guess obvious question there is, when you were writing these poems, what came first? Were you writing them and you said, oh, this is going to be in prose? Or did you decide to write it in prose beforehand? Or did it start in verse and go to prose? How did that decision get made, that some of the material?
Yeah, each one's a little bit different. Ultimately, when I decide to do something as a prose poem, is because I feel that the line breaks are interrupting me. They're interrupting the voice in my head, you know, the writer in my head. And so I feel like I don't want to stop. And a lot of times when I use repetition, I like the prose, the way the prose handles it, because to have a repetition and then have a line break again, and sort of, sometimes to me that becomes, it's like highlighting the repetition too much. You know, you have a repeated line in its own unit, you know, several times, where I like how that just sort of goes and flows in the poetry. It's repetition, but it's also sort of blanketed in all that, in all the rest of the language. So that's how kind of like how I decide ultimately. But I do go back and forth, and usually the first impulse will be one or the other. But I will play back and forth and say, wow, wait, there's line breaks in here. I'll say, you know what, this isn't really working. I can't see the stanzas. I can't see, you know, where the stanza breaks are. I can't see the line breaks. I'm going to try it in prose, and then sometimes go back and put it back. So it's always a process that makes sense. But what's interesting about that is that I've been writing more and more prose poems, I think, and you're making me think as you're asking me that question, in the ways of that I think I need to, sort of the poetry wants to go somewhere else, and so the prose is sort of pushing me to write, keep on with the narratives, but go, you know,
more
prose direction.
Yeah. Do your poems go through a lot of drafts? We were talking, Naomi was saying that sometimes poems sit in her drawers for months or years before they finally get finished. Do your poems go through a lot of drafts?
I usually write, I finish a poem like a week, to the point where I'm okay with it, where I feel, okay, this is the first draft, and then I just put it away. And what I'll do is when I'm ready to start maybe looking at a book, I gather them all up and read them all together, and sometimes I go through the whole thing and edit or revise poem by poem.
So
that's been my process.
So you're writing the poems and putting them away, not thinking about a book at all.
I do, but it's sort of in the background, and I got to keep it in the background.
Yeah.
If not, the engineer comes out in me and wants to like manipulate it too much, and then I'm going to write 52 poems about drinking coffee. You know, and so you just want to over control it and not letting it. Like, for example, I started thinking about that this next book is going to be a book about poetry, as I'm interested in the fiction of the myth of America and television, and I started writing all these poems about I Dream of Jeannie and all this kind of stuff from the Cuban perspective and watching it, and I thought it's going to be like, you know, this book on like, you know, all TV stuff, and I'm realizing that it's much larger than that. And I'm realizing that poetry is, and I wrote them all as prose poems, and I'm realizing poetry is not necessarily the best genre for. I don't feel the poetic voice in me in there. I feel the prose voice. And I think I'm taking that project and making it either nonfiction essays or personal essays, or maybe even completely build a little house on Mango Street around it. You know, something fictionalized. It's poetry, memoir, fiction, novel, essay, all like, which is what's wonderful about that book. It's anything and everything you want it to be.
Yeah.
And I'm thinking of moving that with that direction and leaving. I know when it's, and I've gotten to the point where I know when it's poetry, like it's that little wounded child inside of me that wants to write poems, not I Love Lucy.
What does your family make of the the trajectory that your career has taken, as far as, you know,
Um,
poetry. Then you left engineering for a while, and then you've come back to it.
Right. Well, my
What?
mother's ecstatic that I have health insurance and I'm now back with the engineers, and she still worries that because I only work 30 hours a week. Um, this the deal I struck with them,
Mm-hmm.
and she sees me traveling all the time. And going, she's like, "You better be careful." Like,
What about
she's
the poetry? Does she respond? Does she?
no, she's still like.
Oh, that's nice.
I mean, she's proud of me in the way that a mother's proud of me, and she can recognize being a professor. She can recognize having a book published, but she doesn't really understand. In her book, still she would always say, "Sí, pero él es ingeniero," yeah, he's a great poet, but he's also an engineer. He has a real job. Like my son's a doctor, um, but even then, like it's kind of upsetting. Like even then, like she's like, and they pay you to go around and read your poems. I'm like, yeah, it's more than engineering. It's like, I make more per hour in poetry.
So in her mind,
So they don't.
in her mind, your real career is your engineering career.
And that has slowly gotten better throughout the years. Like before, it's like when I was getting a master's, they're like, "What is that in? And what are you gonna do with that?" Like, and then there's also the language barrier, so they can't appreciate the poetry because they don't. It's not even the same tradition. Like I go to Cuba and my mother tells them I'm a poet. They're like, "Sing to us if you're a poet." Like there's a whole oral.
Yeah.
La
Declamación.
décima, yeah, and like I'm like I don't sing poetry. Like,
Have you thought about figuring out? Have you thought about arranging for your poems to be translated into Spanish? Is that something you've ever thought about?
um,
To make them available to another readership?
I like in passing. I've
Mm.
not. I've done some translations of some of the work.
Yeah, I mean,
for textbooks and things like that.
I mean, in the last poem in the first book, there's 2 versions, right?
Oh,
Palma,
yeah.
Palma Mia.
That one was mine. Those are both mine, though.
Yeah.
But from that book, Havana says I translated.
Mm-hmm.
That was horrible. It was so hard to do because there was no sarcasm and.
Mm-hmm.
Irony
But it's not something that
translates so well into Spanish, and so like you couldn't make God seem funny enough in Spanish. So I don't know. I kind of like that idea, but I also feel like at least with that work that was so narrative, it's such sort of I don't know a weird different tradition, and I don't know that they would translate so well because really.
or maybe
Well, I should say the audience, it might not mean the same thing to a Spanish audience. So like
Except
the idea
that-
of eating peanut butter might be funny. To
except that I would say to play devil's advocate, you mentioned earlier Adam Zagajewski.
Right.
The fact that you like Adam Zagajewski means that you've read him. I'm assuming you've read him in translation, not in
Yeah.
Polish. So
I know Polish fruit.
who's to say that some young Latin American
That's true.
whose first language. Yeah.
If you
But it's
know
not.
anybody.
Yeah.
But I've never sort of pursued it
Yeah.
actively because there's always been. But maybe it is time. Especially I think the second book has even that potential because they are a little more friendly in terms of
Yeah.
a broader audience.
Yeah.
The Europe, the travel poems, still with that sense of
Yeah.
looking and traveling and myths and all that. So.
Let me ask you the last question if we have enough time. I think we do. So given your interesting trajectory, you've been teaching for a while, you're back to engineering, and what advice would you give to someone who's 20 years old and thinking about being a poet, based on your own experience?
20?
Yeah.
I don't
Besides,
know what
don't do
like
it.
anymore.
No. Someone who's 20 is asking you, I want to be a poet. What advice do you have for me?
I gotta say, like, I hated at the beginning that I had this dual career. And as a teacher, I used to get that a lot. Students would come up to me and then like, my parents want me to study this and blah, 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 and I want to study that. And I always tell them, look, it's more complex than you think. It's not black or white. It's not A or B. I said, you got to think for yourself, first of all, but you also don't discount what your parents tell you, but don't also think that...
Don't be overly romantic about it.
Don't be overly romantic, which is something I'm still dealing with, because I also I made the crossover, like, from the world of engineering to poetry, thinking that everybody in the poetry world was this great artist and just wonderful people that
Not the
weren't
case.
petty at all, that were beyond everything. They were the artists, the leaders of art. Like, of society, you know. Boy.
And you found that there's as many
Kind of
backbiters in that
just
world
as
as there
effed
is.
up as everything else in that sense. Granted, a bit better, obviously, but the sense of like that we always have these overly romantic expectations. And I say, try to pick something that you feel that you can do and will be fun for you, but that will give you some sense of livelihood. And then I tell them, don't get an undergraduate in writing. Like, get something that you think you can be comfortable in, journalism, or something that you feel you can still do, and then keep an eye for going for your master's in creative writing, because that's really, I think, write for a while, get to know authors on your own too, and then, keep the master's in mind, because I think that's really where you're going to come out with at least a book, something to shop around, something that, and then it's a matter of transitioning, and look at me, like I went and I did the whole thing, MFA, book, job, as a professor, and then came back to engineering. So, you never know. And now I love it, and I love having that duality and like being in between spaces, like you say all the time. So I just advise to never let go of the passion, but also be practical and as much as you can be, and not lose sight of the dream at the same time for the sake of practicality. I never feel like you're selling out or anything like that. Everybody's got to live.
Yeah, you have to put foot on the table. Well, listen, thank you very much. It's been a great interview. Okay,
Pleasure.
thanks.